Have you ever discovered your boss was lying to cheat you out of benefits? I worked for a large retail chain for several years. It wasn't my dream career, but it paid the bills while I finished grad school. When I finally earned my license, I was qualified for a higher level position, more pay, better title, and actual career growth. But the market was tight, and offers were scarce. So I stayed with my company and took a floater position. Floaters didn't have a fixed store. We covered shifts across multiple locations in a huge region, some close, some ridiculously far. I was assigned to train at one of the busiest and most chaotic stores in the state, about 100 miles from home. It was a tough location, constant stress, high volume, and endless staff turnover. After training, I expected to rotate to other stores, like floaters were supposed to. But week after week, my schedule showed that same faraway store. I asked my district boss about it, and he said I was the only one experienced enough to handle that location. It sounded like a weak excuse, but I didn't argue. Then a coworker told me something interesting. Company policy allowed mileage reimbursement for anyone traveling more than 50 miles each way. You could claim mileage beyond that distance, even meal expenses. My commute easily qualified. I filled out the forms and handed them to my boss for approval. Weeks passed. Nothing. When I followed up, he said they must have gotten lost in the system. That didn't sound right. The same coworker then showed me a workaround. I could fax the forms directly to accounts payable and skip my boss entirely. So I did. Not long after, I got a call from my boss sounding panicked. He told me to stop sending in those forms. I told him I'd stop if he moved me closer to home. He refused, saying I was too important at that store. Then he offered a promotion. He'd make me a permanent staff member there if I agreed to stop filing for reimbursements. He promised the pay bump would come later. Of course, it never did. 2 years went by, and things only got worse. The store was exhausting. Management was unbearable, and I'd had enough. I told him I wanted to step down from the staff position and go back to being a floater so I could work closer to home again. That's when he dropped the lie. He said I was never a staff member, that I'd always been a floater. Yet he still refused to let me work elsewhere because the customers were used to me. That's when everything clicked. He'd lied about my title to keep me at that miserable store and avoid reimbursing my miles. I stayed quiet, but inside, I was furious. I started job hunting. It took nearly a year, but eventually, I landed my dream opportunity outside the company. Once I had the offer, I gave my notice. And that's when the fun began. I remembered that reimbursement policy. There was no time limit on submitting claims, and I had meticulous records of every shift I worked. So, I began filling out reimbursement forms for the last 2 years, every single one of those long commutes. I skipped meal claims to save time, but I got a friendly store manager to sign off on the mileage. Then I faxed them directly to accounts payable again. I didn't send them all at once, just a few dozen at a time during my final 2 weeks. I figured worst case, they'd reject them. A few days later, checks started arriving in the mail, not added to my paycheck, separate, direct payments. Mileage reimbursements are non-taxable, so the money went straight into my pocket. A few weeks after I left, my old boss called me, furious. He said I wasn't eligible for reimbursements because I had agreed to forfeit them as part of my staff role. Then he said loss prevention was getting involved and demanded I pay everything back immediately. He didn't realize I had all the receipts, literally and figuratively. I had emails where he told me I was never staff, that I was a floater the entire time. I sent him the thread and copied HR on it for good measure. HR reviewed it and confirmed that I was entitled to every reimbursement I'd submitted. He had no response. By the time everything cleared, I had received over $21,000 in reimbursements, fully legitimate and tax-free. It was every mile of those miserable commutes, finally paid back in full. The best part was knowing that all of it came directly out of his budget. His attempt to save money by lying ended up costing him tens of thousands instead. Before I left, I quietly shared the reimbursement process with several other floaters who had been told the same lie. It turned out my boss had been blocking a lot of people from claiming what they were owed. Once they started submitting their own forms directly, the whole thing blew up. I moved on to my new career, where the pay was better, the people were honest, and no one was pretending I wasn't entitled to what I'd earned. But the day I cashed that final reimbursement check, I couldn't help but smile, because for once, my boss had to deal with the consequences of his own lies.